This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming, and on this video we're going to be discussing the alignment system in D&D. Now, sometimes when we make these kind of videos, might seem like we're doing sort of a hate train on D&D, and not at all. We both absolutely love the game. The alignment system in particular, for me, creates one of my very favorite parts of the game, which is the great real cosmology. If you're not familiar, essentially every alignment that can exist, whether it's lawful good, chaotic evil, you have a plane of existence that is entirely dedicated to that. One of the most interesting and sort of lore-rich parts of the D&D history, or the D&D lore, is what's called the Blood War, which is the eternal war between the Abyss, which is a chaotic evil plane, and the Nine Hells, which is a lawful evil plane. And one of my favorite things about the story of that war is how it ended, which is Asmodeus, the Lord of the Nine Hells, had been in secret deals with the demon lords to keep the war going and not actually try to end it because they were all profiting off of it. But when Asmodeus ascended to godhood, he sort of lost interest and displaced the Abyss so that it no longer had a direct border with the Nine Hells. That's just the most lawful evil thing ever, is to keep a conflict going and have this fanatical dedication to it that you instill in all of your followers, and then as soon as it's no longer profitable, to just go ahead and decide, nope, we're not going to do that anymore, and move on to your next, evil Mr. Burns scheme. But there are definitely some issues with the alignment system as they relate to playing characters.
Yes, and we've actually talked about this a little bit before. In our last video with Warlocks and Paladins, we discussed the problems with building a class based on singular alignments. But going into a little more detail, one of the biggest things that I find is that either alignments don't mean anything in a campaign anyway, like a DM will just put no emphasis on them, or they mean absolutely everything, which is in and of itself also a problem. Because, for example, someone could argue, well, but if you're lawful good, can you then go outside of your alignment to help a person who needs to steal some bread, And the answer to that is yes, because you are not bound by your moral obligations. I have a moral obligation not to break the social contract, but there's nothing physically stopping me from going out and punching a guy if I wanted to. I won't, but the theoretical possibility remains there. And so that's what bothers me about it, just off the top of my head right now, is just the fact that DMs tend to place too much emphasis on characters following their alignment to the letter. They're like, well, if you're lawful good, you can't do anything bad ever, not even once. And if you're chaotic neutral, well, then you're just a murder hobo.
In fairness, I've never played a chaotic character of any alignment who wasn't a murder hobo, but that's neither here nor there. One thing that is definitely an issue for me with lawful alignments is, and there, as with many other things, this is something you need to address in your session 0 with your DM and the rest of the party. If I am a very devoutly religious person, if I'm a religious fundamentalist, and the laws of the religion that I follow are in conflict with the laws of the state that I'm living in, that creates a situation where you have to ask whose laws is this lawful character beholden to, because that's a genuine conundrum, and it's a genuine issue. It doesn't have to be an issue for your character. You could just say, my paladin follows his oath, and that is all my paladin cares about, regardless of where he is. Or you could say, my character is lawful, and therefore will follow the laws of whatever country he's in to the letter. But you do have to kind of have that distinction ahead of time, and you do have to have your party know what that distinction is. In addition, you have to have some kind of concept that's agreed upon among the party about what the delineation of good, chaotic, and neutral is. As I just mentioned, I had a character who I'd mentioned on this channel before, Chalice, who was a half-elf, specifically half-drow, who his alignment, as I wrote him, was chaotic neutral. And the reason why I picked neutral was because, unlike, for example, the Drow, he was not looking to sacrifice anybody to his god. He wasn't going out of his way to commit murder. But if somebody wronged him or slighted him in any way, he was in no way good. He had no problem using violence to address the issue, up to and including murder. And a lot of the other members of the party viewed that as being more of an evil alignment. So I'm not saying one way is right or the other, but you do have to let your party know what to expect.
Yeah, so the other thing that bothers me about it is the alignment system is completely relative. Even the book acknowledges this. For example, lawful evil people follow their own code. There isn't a singular law that rules over all evil creatures, you know. So that's something which is overlooked, and actually I find that a good example that there is no true definition of lawful are aboleths. And I'm going to use the word servant here so we don't get no monetized. But anyway, the aboleths, they are, in the book, described as lawful evil creatures. Now here's the thing. The most definitions of evil on a very simple level simply state that evil is a harmful or detrimental action to the greater populace. Now, please consider that most humans consider change to be harmful. So, for example, if an aboleth wants to establish a kingdom, most humans would be opposed to that just on concept alone. So that automatically makes an aboleth evil to all non-aboleth species, but good to itself. On top of that, you may think that them owning servants makes them by default evil. I would argue that it does not, because if you look at the lore behind aboleths, they do not force that servitude onto the people who become their servants. They offer them promises of wealth and whatever they dream of, and they actually do grant that in the form of psychic visions. So, out of all of the races that force others into servitude, they're the only one which actually lets someone make the choice to enter it, and actually gives them something for their work, to the point where I would argue that they should not be described slavers or evil.
Yes, and that's actually an interesting point when it comes to building a character, is that it can be an interesting situation to have where your character might consider themselves one alignment, but turn out to, in practice and in the things they do, actually be another. That could add a real level of complexity and interest to a character. So, for example, if you have a paladin who defines himself as lawful good, I keep going back to paladins for lawful good because that's the stereotype, but obviously it could be anything. It could be a fighter, it could be a ranger, it could be a wizard. If you have a character who defines themselves as lawful good, but then goes out of their way to murder hobo anybody who doesn't follow their exact definitions of lawful and good, there's a strong case to be made that that character is actually evil. And that creates a really, really good dynamic for roleplay and for interactions with the party and for interactions with the larger campaign world. If the other party members, if the other players and the DM are up for it, because you can have a really creative and interesting character arc where the character considers themselves one thing but the world views them as another. And I just want to be absolutely 1,000% clear with this. If, as a DM, you're thinking, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to have this wizard who considers himself lawful good come in contact with whatever book it is that's the opposite of the Book of Vile Darkness, the one that's the Tome of Pure Good, I forget the name. I'm going to have him come into contact with that, but it will reject him because, no, don't do that or anything like that. That's really lame. That's really played. It's just a kind of a nasty trick on your players. But having it play out in the campaign where the common folk he interacts with, and even maybe the authorities that he has to interact with, start to view him as being something other than he considers himself, could be a really compelling plot hook.
Yeah, so when that brings up two things for me, one of which is I personally feel as though all the spells which have something to do with alignment in the book should be relative to the nation where they're being cast in, or the caster should be able to choose what set of laws they are comparing this person to from the spell's perspective. You know, because a good example of that would be, modern day, I'm chaotic good. I fully plan to pay my taxes this year. I work a part-time job. I do everything in society I'm supposed to. If you put me in the middle of no-no Germany in the 1940s, I'm going to be chaotic evil because I'm going to be attacking everyone in that country until they collapse. So you really have to allow for the players using, say, detect good and evil to say, well, is it good or evil based on Strahd's domain, or is it good or evil based on the celestial plane? Because those are going to be two entirely different definitions of good and evil.
You actually bring up a really interesting point there. You say you consider yourself chaotic, and yet you pay your taxes, you generally follow the law, so you're coming up with a different definition of chaotic than some others might have. And for some people, chaotic would be people who willfully break the law, people who willfully run red lights and steal things and cheat on their taxes and steal the wages of the people who work for them. So even if you're talking about the context of the actual real world in which you live, people can come up with very different definitions of what constitutes good, evil, or neutral, and lawful, neutral, or chaotic. Something that is an interesting point to go with, too, is that very few people in real life consider themselves evil. The only people I specifically remember ever identifying themselves that way were, while I never partook of the substance myself, during my misspent youth, I had some contact with heroin addicts, and some of them were self-aware enough to realize that the addiction had consumed them to the point, they didn't necessarily blame the drug itself, but they were able to recognize that their behavior was selfish to the point of being evil. And that is something that could get really, really complex and interesting in a character's backstory. For example, if your character's background is that he was a farmer who had experienced famine a few years in a row and did not have the ways and means to feed his family, and then a fiend appeared to this person and offered them the ability to do that in exchange for some sort of infernal contract, you could have someone whose motives are good, who is a good person, but who's being compelled to do evil by circumstances. It doesn't have to be warlocks specifically. We always pick on warlocks for evil. It could very well be something like a situation where they became a mercenary, so that could be a fighter or a barbarian. Or you could also have a John Constantine-style character where, for whatever reason, they're forever making deals with good or bad, celestials, fiends, or whatever, because they need something that only those things could go. It would actually be a really interesting concept to have a Constantine-based character who's both a celestial and a fiend patron warlock who's got a little bit of both. You'd really have to spend some time working that out with your DM, but it would definitely be a fun and interesting character.
Yes, and also what I find to be very interesting is taking a look at the D&D lore and then comparing it to a different game, which I personally play a lot and enjoy, and I know that basically anyone who's going to be listening to this has at least heard of this game. With the game Fallout New Vegas, there is something called the Karma system inside of it, which actually is very similar to the D&D alignment, but just a little bit simplified. Here's the thing. With that universe, there is a faction which is completely xenophobic and takes servants and literally wants to burn the world down to start over again. And and killing soldiers from that faction does not give you good karma, and joining them does not give you bad karma. The Democratic faction, you join them, you do not get good karma. You kill their soldiers, you do not get bad karma. That's something which should really be applied to D&D, is also when someone represents an ideology, especially when someone represents when someone represents something but they themselves are not controlling it, it makes no sense for there to be a penalty for them if they are not the sort of overseer or the puppet master. For example, I would argue that killing a zombie who's been possessed by like a stranded spirit or whatever it is, I don't think that killing them should give you any kind of boost if you're a good character, because that doesn't really make any sense. The spirit was bound against their will, and on top of that, they themselves actually have no consciousness. They don't really control what they're doing. I would argue that maybe killing someone like Strahd, that works a little bit, but even then, Strahd, it's actually written in the book, Strahd considers himself to be a good person because he's managing the realm that he rules over. So even killing him, it doesn't. You can agree with Strahd and actually make a good moral argument for that.
So that actually brings up an interesting point that I've experienced in real life. The creature in all of the cosmology that nobody would ever feel bad about killing is probably a car salesman, which is what I was for about a year. And, I got into it with the best of intentions. I had been in sales for a while, in retail sales, and I just needed something that would pay me a little bit more. And to be clear, I was about as honest of a car salesman as there ever was or ever will be. And there are special places in hell for people who do the things car salesmen do every day, which is why I got out of it. It was one of the reasons why I got out of it was I just couldn't do it anymore for various reasons. But for that year and a couple of months, that was what I was doing, and my personal alignment didn't mean much. And anybody who's worked as sort of a working cog in a large corporation, I've also done insurance claims and things like that, sometimes your position and your situation forces you to do things that you don't agree with. So that can be a really interesting and compelling situation for your character, and there again, something to discuss with your DM is how many times can your character be compelled to do something that is against their code before it actually changes who they are, what their alignment is, etc. and so forth. I'm going to hand it off to Mara to wrap it up. At every D&D video, or every YouTube video, they say like, comment, share, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Generally, though, comment here. Let us know what you think. What are your thoughts on the alignment? What are some situations you had either IRL or in-game that tested your code of alignment, and how did you resolve them?
Yep, and we do thank you for watching, and we do plan to release a video in not too long. I believe we have discussed fighters and barbarians next, if I recall correctly. So we'll be releasing something on the problems with those classes and some suggestions on how to balance that out. So we hope that you'll be joining us for that. Thank you for watching.